Hello, welcome to The Horticulturalist. I am Matthew Lucas.
And I'm Stephen Ryan, and we post a video every Friday. So why not hit subscribe and the alert button so that you'll be aware of what we're up to every week.
And if you've got a burning horticultural question for Stephen Ryan, put it in the comments below and he will answer them in 60 seconds in Monday in our shorts.
Yes, I'll do my very, very best. And if you want to learn more about plants and horticulture in general and mix with a very, very like-minded group of people, if you happen to be in Australia, maybe you should join the Royal Horticultural Society of Victoria, of which I happen to be patron.
I was going to say, who is the patron? And we'll put the link below.
Yes, so that's a great august organisation that is promoting amateur horticulture everywhere in Australia. So well worth getting involved with.
But that's not the only thing you do, Stephen Ryan, is it not?
No, it's not. One of the other things I do is I lead tours.
Without me.
Yeah, well, you know, one day you'll be able to afford to come on tours with me. Ha ha ha. Yes, so I take tours to many different places around the world for a company called Australians Studying Abroad. But we take tours to all sorts of places around the world, and of course I lead some of their garden tours.
Now, just so happens then that you were in France.
Ooh, yes.
It's midwinter in Australia. It is... well, it's summer in France.
Yeah.
Lucky you is all I have to say.
Yeah, well, it was beautiful. And the tour was based around Normandy and Brittany.
Yep.
So that northwest part of France.
Yeah.
And it is a mecca for gardens.
Is
so,
it?
Oh, some of the most fabulous gardens you could ever imagine seeing. So it was a beautiful tour, thoroughly enjoyed it.
So what we're going to do today is actually take a trip through 3 of the gardens that you visited and just look at some of the high points and perhaps how they relate to Stephen's garden. But was there a theme in these gardens and why they were chosen?
Yeah, well, the ones we're going to talk about today were definitely gardens of passionate collectors of one form or another. They were generalist collectors, which I find really interesting. Some people become passionate about plants and they end up collecting, let's say, orchids or aroids or carnivorous plants.
Plants extinct in the wild.
Yes, and camellias, which fit in both categories. Because
and
this is Camellia AMPLEXICAULIS, which is in fact extinct in the wild. So these people are collectors of interesting plant material, and of course they've got the climate and soil to do it in.
Well, actually, I've got 2 things to ask you, but quickly touch on the climate of where we are.
All right, so Brittany and Normandy, much cooler than southern France, of course, so they don't have that Mediterranean climate. They get quite a bit of summer rain, and they've got deep soils. There's oodles of groundwater as well, so there's streams and ponds and water going everywhere. And so with those deep soils and that benign climate, because it's also not particularly cold in the winter because it's got sort of the English Channel just nearby, so they don't get a lot of heavy frosts and things. So they can grow plants from practically everywhere. It's just wonderful.
So not dissimilar to Melbourne, apart from the summer temperatures and it's wetter during summer. But a similar mild winter and a range of things that we can grow.
Yeah, exactly. So, we have to struggle more with our summers and drought conditions, which Normandy and Brittany don't, but nonetheless, not dissimilar.
So, big question then. Collectors. Stephen, are you a collector?
I sort of think I am, but again, I'm a jack-of-all-trades type collector. I'm not necessarily wedded to one group of plants. So for me, it's more, and probably with these collectors as well, it was more about the rarity and the interesting forms and, you know, the fact that they're not generally available from the big barns and the normal garden centres. It's the hunting down, the plant you didn't know you wanted until you met it.
Couldn't live without.
Yes, exactly. So it's all those
And I
things.
think that happened a little bit for you on this trip. We'll get to that though. We should cut the chat and get on to the first garden, which is where?
The first garden we're going to visit is one called Cardillo, and it is a wonderful and large garden.
Well, let's go. Okay, Stephen, garden number 1.
All right, garden number 1 is Cardillo in Brittany. It's a huge garden. It's in the midst of being revamped at the moment. New owners have taken it on, and it's fabulous.
Interesting point then. So when was it planted? Obviously that person is now dead.
Yes, it was originally purchased by a Russian prince of all things.
No, we love Russian princes.
Yeah,
Stephen.
and he must have been a little bit bored because he took on a big garden and started collecting and also started landscaping. So ponds went in, paving went down, walls went in, and all that sort of thing, and just started collecting plants. And he seemed to have a penchant for all sorts of interesting groups. So palms were one of the things that he particularly liked.
Yes, and at the beginning of the footage, you see quite a panorama of palms. Now, you two, in fact, one's right behind us.
Yeah, how did that happen?
Cold climate palms.
Yes, so... And
are they from similar regions as yours?
Yes, they would have, well, most of what was at this particular garden were Trachycarpus Fortunei, the windmill palm, which is quite a toughie.
And quite common.
One could say that. But they do give a lovely tropical effect in a non-tropical climate.
True,
so people love palms for that reason.
Yes.
And the other features in the garden that I really bonded to, one of them was we're walking along and we looked up and here was this cloud of little white blooms everywhere, this huge plant hanging out of an enormous oak tree. And I turned to our guide and said, what am I looking at? Because it was sort of in a distance. And he said, that's Rosa Kiftsgate.
Now, even I know about that. So Kiftsgate is a famous garden in Britain,
Yeah.
famous for its rose.
Yes.
Well, the rose was named after the garden.
Yeah, and it's not the only thing Kiftsgate is known for, but certainly the Kiftsgate rose is well known. It is a monstrous rose. It grows vast. It's one of the Rosa gigantea forms, and the plant at Kiftsgate covers an enormous area. The plant at Carlo is supposed to be the second biggest of the plant in the world, and it's virtually covering a whole oak tree.
And it is stunning. And I guess just to contextualize then, that is one of those species roses that only blooms once in a year, so for a short period of time. So not much bang for buck, but when it does bang, whatever the metaphor is,
yes,
there's
it
a lot
really goes
going
on. Now, I tried to do that here.
I was going to say, there's a reason why we're standing next to a gum tree.
Yes. Now, my house is behind the gum tree, and this big gum tree was there, and I had this brilliant idea.
And it is brilliant.
Yeah. I was going to grow Rosa Kiftsgate up through this gum tree, and then it would come hanging out of the gum tree, and from our upstairs windows, we would be looking straight out into the rose.
For 2 weeks a year. But anyway,
2 weeks.
I must say that would have been beautiful. What happened, Stephen Ryan?
Australia has possums. And so what I ended up with was an odd little flower on the end of a rather spiky looking stem. So it looked like leftover barbed wire with little tiny bits of white flowers on the end of it. And in the end, I got so tired of it that I actually got a ladder out, because I had it probably 30 feet up into the gum tree before the...
Oh, so it really took off?
Oh, yes, before the possums actually found it. It was off and away, and it was fantastic, and I was getting quite smug. But anyhow, that wasn't to be. And so I ended up having to get a ladder out and cut it down out of the tree, and alas, no Kiftsgate rose in my garden. But there you go.
It is odd, though. I didn't know possums would really dig roses. But anyway, what else struck you about the garden as well?
Oh, well, there was quirky things about the garden. And one of the quirky plantings was a whole copse of monkey puzzles, Araucaria ARAUCANA, from Chile.
We have done a special about Araucaria. And is this not one of your bucket list trees of being in a snow-clad Chilean forest?
Yeah, and I did it, and it was fantastic. So I walked onto completely untrammeled snow with huge big monkey puzzles, all covered with snow, and then it started snowing again. And it was just wonderful.
Were you dead? No, you weren't.
No.
But actually, we also mentioned monkey puzzles in our collaboration with Rachel at Gardening in Windsor, because this is one of the things you said that you wished you could grow, that she can grow very easily in Ireland.
Yeah, because they love the damper, cooler climate. So they're fine further up on the mountain above me, but they're not really good down here where it gets dry in the summer.
Yeah.
Damn it. So another thing, speaking of conifers of a rare form, another thing that seems to be the flavour of the month in Normandy and Brittany is our Australian native Wollemi pine. So Wollemia nobilis. And this garden had quite a nice svelte specimen of it that was getting up nice and big.
Now, this might explain why... Well, I guess it's obvious. A lot of our international viewers, whenever they've caught a glimpse of a Wollemi in the back of our films, of which there has been a few, have always said, why don't you engage with that? Maybe we should, Steve.
Yeah, well, it is an amazing plant. Of course, it's named after the park it comes from, but I love its species name, which is nobilis, and that would mean noble, obviously, but it's a play on words as well, because the man who actually discovered the plant in that gorge was a guy by the name of Noble.
We shouldn't go any further though, because we should do a whole film about it.
The other thing, of course, about this particular garden is it has got a really good collection of New Zealand native plants.
Which I think, as we travel through these 3 gardens, is a bit of a sub-theme.
It is, because the New Zealand climate is very similar to that of Normandy and Brittany in lots and lots of ways.
Yes.
So they've collected.
I understand.
Yeah. So they've collected a lot of stuff that comes from New Zealand, which is fantastic. So one of the plants that stood out for me, there was a lovely trimmed sort of amorphous mound of a plant called Pseudowintera colorata. It's one of the New Zealand pepper bushes, and it has the most bizarre sort of almost pinky burgundy mottled foliage, so it's a really unusual leaf.
Very beautiful. And is it in Australia? Have you seen it?
We can get it here. I have grown it at different times. I should start growing some more of it again. It won't grow in my garden because it gets too dry, but I can grow it in the garden up at the nursery. They used it beautifully as this sort of mounded effect near a little Chinese temple.
So 2 things. The texture of this garden, the forms and the sculptural nature of how the different forms, colour and texture, it's very beautifully laid out. Whoever our Russian prince was obviously had a great eye for colour and form. The other thing is just how beautiful that stone house is, just that warm colour, and then the stonework throughout, the fountains, the water, as you mentioned, it's a wet place. What a paradise. And on a hill, so is it quite... Is there any flat bits to the garden?
Well, there is a nice flat formal garden below the house, but most of it is quite slopey and very informal. It just follows the contours. So you wander down through the garden, round the house, right down through the valley, so that you go down virtually to the coast, and then you wander back again, up through the formal garden and back to the house. It is just amazing, and I'm so pleased to see that this garden has now got into the hands of somebody who's going to take it on, and they're going to take it to the next level.
There you go.
So it's really beautiful.
Because that is a thing about major gardens in private hands. But now let us go into our second garden, which is still in the hands of the person who planted it.
Yes, what a good idea.
Off we go. Stephen, now there is a reason why we had this cunning low angle. Where are we now?
All right, well, we're visiting another garden in Brittany called Cur Louis, and Louis, the owner, is still with us and collecting like a mad thing.
Like there is no tomorrow. And we mentioned this before, there is a bit of a New Zealand sub-theme, which is why we've got this plant.
Yes.
I'll come and show you.
Yes.
This plant here, which is...
the New Zealand Marlborough rock daisy, Pachystegia insignis.
Which is in this very garden, and a beautiful example.
Yes, far better than mine, actually. And this garden is... he's got passions about certain groups of plants, but again, it's about collecting the rare, the interesting and the unusual. He told me he had 60 different varieties of plants that are in the family Araucaria.
Now, viewers, you might not be aware that this is a pressure point for Stephen in terms of passion. Tell us about your jealousy, Stephen.
He had Brasiopsis, which I don't think is even in the country. He had Schefflera travesioides, which I'm sure is not in the country. So he's got a whole range of weird and wonderful plants from all over the place. And he takes his passion to the nth degree, because he even travels overseas to bring plants back to France.
So this is an interesting point for viewers outside of Australia. Australia has incredibly strict biosecurity law, which means it is virtually impossible to bring living plant material into the country, and actually extremely difficult to bring seeds in.
Yes, it's becoming harder and harder too. So it used to be difficult, now it's almost getting to the impossible, particularly if you haven't got very deep pockets and a lot of time and effort that you can put into bringing something in. So it's getting really, really hard to get new plant material in Australia, unfortunately.
So how did you feel when he can just trot off to Vietnam and bring back rare plants?
Well, it's really odd because, you know, I had a serious case of green jealousy, I have to say, that he had some of these plants that I would just kill for. They're just absolutely fabulous. And he showed me things I didn't know existed because we've never seen them in Australia. And believe it or not, one of the highlight plants of the trip was a Photinia. So Photinias in general, in most parts of the world, are considered to be very ordinary, screening, hedging shrubs. But of course, it doesn't pay to tar things with the one brush.
Which is what you're always saying, glycoxalis.
Yes, exactly. So he had a Photinia in the garden, and he grabbed me by the hand and dragged me into the middle of a border, much to the delight and somewhat shock of the whole group that were with me, to show me a Photinia, of all things. And he showed me this Photinia MYRIANTHES, or MYRIANTHA, which I'd never seen before, and it's got big leaves, it's bold, it's gutsy, it's like nothing I've seen before. I couldn't wait to get home to at least do some research on it and find out more about it. He's apparently got the only plant in France, and he bought it back from, I don't know, the wilds of northern Myanmar or Vietnam or somewhere like that, into his garden, and he's got the only one in France. Now, if I was gardening in France, it wouldn't be the only one for long, because I'd propagate from his. But it's a little harder here.
And isn't that, we're going to drop in a picture of a different leaf. What's the story with the two leaves?
Oh, yes, it's an evergreen, like most Photinias are. And so it's got these wonderful, big, very, very heavily veined leaves. And although it's evergreen, as leaves die, they go the most beautiful shades of red before they start to drop. So it was a really quirky looking plant with these sort of big leaves, mainly clustered towards the top of rather bare stems. And if somebody had said to me, "What do you think that is, Stephen?" I probably would not have picked Photinia.
Well, there you go. What else struck you in this garden?
Well, I have to say another, what you would consider commonish plant, but in an unusual form, leapt out at me as I was walking around the path, and it was a hydrangea.
Oh.
Now.
Okay, I'm scanning.
Yeah, no hydrangeas.
I was going to say, I
really.
think, you have got a rose, you have got a camellia, you've got quite a few sort of, more run-of-the-mill garden plants, but no hydrangea.
But I've got an issue with our dry soil here, so the classical hydrangeas are a bit of a struggle here. But I saw one in his garden that, again, I would be very, very happy. Probably if I was wealthy, I actually would try and import it, because as far as I know, it's not here. Maybe I can convince a wealthy patron to do such a thing. And it's a Hydrangea macrophylla, which is the common hydrangea. It's one of the lace cap ones with a nice lace cappy flower in a really dark blue, at least in his garden it was. And it had the most fabulous black stems I've ever seen. And it's a hydrangea called, wonderfully, Zorro.
I don't know how appropriate that is, but anyway, the image that we're dropping in and showing, the stems are quite sensational.
Yeah, it would be definitely worthwhile doing.
How was it in the garden? I mean, because hydrangeas are all about the big blousy flower, whereas that surely is more about the stem. How would you plant it so that the stem was the feature, not the flower? Well,
it would need to come forward on the border, so it needs to be towards the front of a border. The flowers, I have to say, were pretty spectacular anyway. So, but it was quite a big shrub. It was probably 2 metres or so tall.
Oh.
So it would need to be a punctuation plant along a border that sort of, as it did with me, stopped me in my tracks as I walked around a corner. And there was this hydrangea staring at me, and I'm thinking, why didn't anybody tell me they'd bred this?
Now, was Louis, the gardener, was he a horticulturist? Was he an amateur? What was his sort of career?
Well, he apparently worked during his working life in the railways.
Oh, so not a gardener at all?
No, and he's taken on this quite large garden, which I assume he started before he retired, because it's very well advanced at this stage, and he's not so advanced in age that, those things would match up. So I'm assuming he'd started gardening whilst he was still working. And now that he is no longer working, the garden is his passion. And it's big, it's complex, it's got masses of different plants. I mean, to start with 60 different Araucaria. It's got beautiful sweeping lawns. You can't find a weed. The whole garden is superbly managed. And he knows the names of all his plants in the garden. And every corner you went round, there was some wonderful thing to see.
Now, this garden did have some sort of themic moments. So the cacti and succulent garden. So let's talk a little bit about, which is about collecting too, but out of context. So you've got like a temperate climate, northwestern France, with a cacti succulent garden. So
odd.
No criticism.
No.
But how do you make those things work? How would you make a Japanese garden work in a Mediterranean climate? How would you make a cacti garden work in a temperate climate? Or does it?
Well, in some ways it doesn't work because it just seems out of place, you know. So, yeah, so Louis got this cacti and succulent garden. He's done it well. I mean, it's got a gravel mulch over it. It's got large boulders in it. You know, he's done all the things that you'd need to show off your cacti and succulents well. And the one thing he's done, which sort of makes it work in one sense, is to make sure that it's fairly well isolated visually from the rest of the garden.
Yeah.
So you walk down a path without any idea what you're coming to, and you more or less have this reveal as you walk into this area. So I guess in one sense you can probably suspend disbelief by walking into...
Oh,
yeah,
I'm in Southern Africa or Mexico.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I think the same works for his, what he calls his Zen garden, which is basically one of those white gravel raked gardens with Japanese maples and bamboos and miniature pines and things.
Because I think the Japanese aesthetic is so specific that is quite hard to replicate in sort of non-Japanese context. But anyway.
Yeah, well, I would always opt for a Japanese-esque looking garden, preferably over having something that was an authentic Japanese garden. And you can evoke an oriental feel quite easily with the plants you select. I mean, bamboo for a start. Immediately you think of the Orient.
And the use of rock too,
Yeah,
so particularly in
So-
Japanese and Chinese gardens. The other thing, another subplot, which
Yeah.
is not only New Zealand plants, but his cornus, Stephen Ryan.
Oh yes, he's got
Keeper of the National Cornus Collection.
He's got some fabulous dogwoods in his garden, and I have to say that was another thing in not necessarily in Louis' garden, but in quite a number of gardens. I saw some beautiful specimens of cornus, and of course I saw several cultivars that aren't here.
Oh dear.
Sadly.
This was a garden about envy and jealousy, Stephen.
Yeah, well, it was, and I have mixed feelings about doing these things. One of the feelings is elation at the education I'm getting while I'm going around, because
That's a
I'm
good
learning
thing,
about new
yes.
things, and it's fantastic. Obviously, the feeling of jealousy and greed and avarice sets in as well, but I know I can't do anything about it, so therefore I try and just keep it on the level of, oh wow, look at that beautiful dogwood or whatever. So there's lots of different levels of it, and also I'm not, even though the climatic conditions there aren't that far dissimilar from ours, because of our hot summers, they grow quite a lot of things I probably couldn't keep alive anyway, so you've just got to look at it from that perspective and go, well, it's lovely to see these things and meet them. I mean, I love going to tropical countries and looking at plants that I'll never be able to grow.
Me too.
Just
Yeah.
for the sake of looking at the plants.
Yes.
So,
And we're just going to drop in a picture now. There was an amazing prunus.
yes. Now that's something that would probably be difficult to get in, even if you wanted to go down that path, because prunuses are related to most of our fruit trees, of course, because you've got, you know, apples and all those other things that are in the Rosaceae family. And if you're going to try and import those, they'd have to be virus indexed. They'd have to go through at least 6 months quarantine. It would be hugely expensive, but I would really like to have Prunus rufa.
The bark. So is it all about the bark of that tree?
Yeah. It has small white flowers,
Blah, blah.
foliage of no particular note,
Blah, blah.
but it's up above your head, so it doesn't matter. And you walk down a path, and this trunk basically hits you in the face as you walk down.
And we have made a video about trunks and bark
Yep.
and coloured stems, which is, we'll link it below.
Yep.
Okay, well, I think we're moving on from Louis' garden onto the next.
Yes, let's do that.
Okay. So, Stephen, where are we now?
All right, so we're at another garden in Brittany, a Jardin de Pellinac, and again, a garden that belongs to a serious collector.
Now, I think you mentioned, in this case, though, this collector is not going out hunting and gathering.
Not as far as I know, but every nursery around is under threat from him. I can tell you that.
Well, not dissimilar to me, because anyway, I do love a nursery, as do you. So tell us about this garden. What was the thing here for you?
All right, well, again, it was collections of interesting plants. I
Yep.
mean, he's got a very comprehensive collection of species rhododendrons. So there's lots of beautiful rhododendron Yakusamanum and some of the other dwarfy ones from Japan. Not only did he have wonderful rhododendrons, he also had fabulous collection of Southern Hemisphere plants, so lots of interesting New Zealand native things.
Yeah, again, sub-theme.
Yeah, it's got the right sort of climate, and yeah, it seemed logical. I saw a beautiful Olearia, one of the New Zealand daisy bushes in the garden there.
Yeah.
I'm not sure of the species, but it might have been MACRODONTA or something similar. And there was lots of other Southern Hemisphere things growing in the garden as well. Of course, the other New Zealand plants that he had a lot of were some of the New Zealand native grasses, and the pheasant grass, Anemanthele lessoniana, was obviously very happy in his garden, and he had big drifts of it, looking lovely and soft and feathery.
So most of these New Zealand things that you saw, are they available in Australia, or are they not crossed the short distance?
Quite a lot of them we do have in Australia. You might have to search around for them a bit, but yeah, a lot of New Zealand plant material has made it into Australia over the years.
And the other thing I saw was, how do you pronounce it?
Xanthorrhoea, yes.
Did not the Empress Josephine have a Xanthorrhoea? I can't remember, in her garden.
Yes, I think she may have done, but it's certainly not something you expect to bump into in France, because the Xanthorrhoeas, or as we'd call them here, tree grass, or grass tree, are a wonderful group of very architectural plants that are well known here in Australia, but are very hard to get overseas.
And not lovers of moisture and dampness and wetness generally.
Yeah, well, he did have it in a sort of a slightly raised area, so it probably had ideal drainage and things and a nice sunny aspect, so he was doing well with it.
Now, the other thing, you know, we're beside a pool, is another sub-theme in all of these gardens is gunnera. I'm seeing a lot of gunnera and beautiful waterways, but lots of gunnera. Yep,
yeah, well, again, because it's so damp, gunnera does really well. And, of course, he had one in his garden I'd never seen before.
Aha!
And we don't know what species it is. He apparently bought it from Krug Farm Nursery, which is in Wales, and Mecca.
Yeah, I was going to say, they're a famous rare plant nursery.
Yeah, I was there once with an open permit to bring plants back many, many years ago.
Do you still have some of those things? Or are they
I've still got a few of those plants that I imported.
And what were they?
Mainly woodland perennials, but I stood in the middle of their sales area and they sort of had these racks all the way around, and I was running around the racks, pulling plants off the racks and handing them to Craig and saying, put those in one spot. And I reckon I spent about £500 in about 2 minutes flat. And most of them came through quarantine when it was a little easier to do. And back then you could have an open permit, so you could bring plants in and then they could be assessed once they got here. Now you have to designate what plant you're bringing in. The one I want's the one I don't know about, so how am I supposed to ask for that?
However, I think the piece de resistance of this garden, which is why we are so cunningly placed by
the pond,
is...
the water iris garden.
Oh, look at this footage.
Yeah.
This is just like a dream. So, firstly, what has he planted in there? What are the species?
Well, it's Iris ensata, which was known as Iris camphori. It's a Japanese water iris, and they can go down into quite a depth of water if needs be. And they're once flowering, and they all tend to come out at much the same time. You'll get probably 4 weeks, maybe 5 weeks of splendour, and then you just don't bother going into that part of the garden the rest of the year.
So, well, let's talk about that then, because he's obviously given up a lot of space. So there's all these boardwalks and these square beds, I suppose. So just technically, was that like a bog garden? Was it running water? Was it like a shallow lake or a pond?
It looked more like mud. There didn't seem to be any free water that I could see, although the irises were so dense it was a little hard to see in between them. And of course the boardwalks were for convenience sake, so that you could get around and engage with your irises. And I guess to a certain extent probably to help separate the different varieties as well, so that he could keep tabs on the different cultivars he had.
I mean, I've seen different types of iris planted in spectacular ways, but I've never seen anything like that.
Yeah, it was very impressive, and I guess we were very lucky as a tour group to be in the garden at the right time of the year to see that.
Which brings us, I guess, to the whole notion, which is what everyone wants these days, is sort of successive planning in gardens, so things going on. You've got, let's say, quite a large kind of square feet of your garden, totally dedicated to an iris that blooms for about 2 to 3 weeks once a year.
Yeah.
What could you do for the rest of the time?
Well, you quite literally don't go in there anymore. The garden is big enough that, and you know, there's lots of other things going on.
Yeah.
It is quite a large garden. I would guess, I don't know exactly, but I'd guess the garden is around about 10 to 15 acres or maybe even more. And I think it also has some surrounding woodland and stuff that belongs to the property.
Right.
So it's a big garden.
Yeah.
So yes, you go in and you get wow factor for 3 or 4 weeks.
But then there'll be somewhere else to go and get a wow.
Yeah. You know, you go and clean the irises up and just not go back again for another 12 months.
But If you, Stephen Ryan, wanted to try and do that, because you are the king of multitasking spaces and plants.
I couldn't do it.
Is there anything else you could plant in there that would flower in autumn or in winter?
Not really, because there are things that you could plant in there that will grow in a bog that might have a different flowering period, but the irises seem not to cope well with a lot of competition.
Right.
So I think you would find your irises would start to get depleted if you planted some other robust bog plant in with them.
Right.
So I think you have to either just
Commit.
use them in small little bits or commit to something like that where you go, all right, well, I think you have to commit. So what you do is you have an area where you really enjoy those things for a short time and then you move on. So I don't think you've got a choice.
Now, 2 questions about those iris. Obviously, full sun.
Yes, you need lots of sun for those.
And are they evergreen or are they herbaceous?
They tend to die down in the winter. So you're going to have a grid of boardwalks to look at in the middle of winter.
That is a really Well, anyway, no, let's focus on the 2 to 3 weeks of sublime blooms and the colours, the flower form. Oh my goodness.
They're beautiful things.
It really is.
And even that probably wasn't a complete collection of that group of iris.
Yeah.
But it was a pretty good one.
Darn good one. Well, I have loved this. I have also just loved seeing the houses. They're so beautiful. That warm stone with the green and the flowers. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, where do you get a 500 or 600-year-old house in Australia?
In a moist area with lots of hard landscaping. I don't know, Stephen.
Yeah, but I can say that you can understand now why there's so many interested gardeners and collectors and plants people who in fact live in Normandy and Brittany.
And not dissimilar to Melbourne in terms of the benign nature of our climate and our ability to grow things, just the hot summers. Well, I would have loved to have gone on that tour, but if you want to go on that tour, we'll put the link below. They're run once a year or a couple of times a year?
Yeah, I won't be doing the French tour next year. I'll be off somewhere else. But yes, the French tour goes every year. I do it about every second year.
But there are other locations, the Spain, Madagascar.
I'm going to Madeira and the Azores.
Morocco.
There's so many different places that we go to look at gardens. So what a hard life I lead.
Oh, yes. So if you're interested, we'll put the link below. And as Stephen mentioned, you don't need to be in Australia, and it's not necessarily about education and learning, more just about observation and enjoyment.
Yeah, and hopefully taking you to places you'd never get into otherwise.
There you go. True. Well, how could we top the grand tour of 3 amazing gardens in France?
By doing another 3, perhaps?
Well, we might.
There's lots more to do on my trip, so they will show up in due course.
They will. So if you want to know what we're doing next week, hit subscribe. We post every week on a Friday.
And don't forget our Monday Shorts. So if you've got a burning horticultural question you'd like me to answer, put it in the comments below. Make sure you put in where you're from, and I will do my very best to answer it for you.
You certainly will. So we look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye all.